Who would have thought that a struggling teen's simple decision to give away his lunch would change his destiny forever? When Marcus ignored the wealthy crowd's insults to feed a filthy old man, he thought he was just being kind. He had no idea that his small act of compassion was about to unlock a billion-dollar secret that would leave the arrogant manager on his knees. The Grand Oakhaven was not merely a hotel, it was a fortress of exclusion, a glittering monolith of marble and gold leaf that dominated the city's financial district. To enter its revolving doors was to leave the grit of the real world behind and step into a sanitized paradise where the air smelled of imported jasmine and old money. Crystal chandeliers, massive and intricate like frozen waterfalls, hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, buttery light over guests who spoke in hushed tones and wore watches worth more than the average family's mortgage. It was a temple built to worship wealth, and every polished surface reflected the entitlement of its patrons. Standing guard over this kingdom was Sterling. He was the general manager, but he carried himself with the haughty demeanor of a deposed monarch. Tall, thin, and impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that hugged his frame without a single wrinkle, Sterling was the embodiment of the hotel's superficial soul. His hair was slicked back with ruthless precision, and his eyes, cold and assessing, scanned the lobby like a predator looking for weakness. To Sterling, poverty was not a systemic issue or a misfortune. It was a contagion. He believed that the wrong sort of people were like dust on a lens. They blurred the perfection he worked so hard to maintain. He would often be seen wiping invisible smudges from the brass railings or snapping his fingers at bellboys to remove a piece of luggage that looked too worn. He was a man who had sold his humanity for the approval of the elite, measuring his self-worth by the exclusivity of the threshold he protected. In brutal, freezing contrast, just 50 feet away, the reality of the city sat shivering on a rusted park bench. Marcus was 17, but the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes belonged to a man 3 times his age. The wind whipped through the park with a cruel bite, cutting easily through the thin fabric of his oversized, faded hoodie. Marcus didn't have a scarf or gloves. He jammed his hands deep into his pockets, trying to preserve what little body heat he had left after a grueling 10-hour shift washing dishes at a diner 3 blocks away. Every detail of Marcus's appearance told a story of struggle and resilience. His sneakers were a tragic patchwork of gray duct tape holding the soles to the canvas, a desperate attempt to keep the winter dampness from seeping into his socks. His backpack, resting on the frozen ground beside him, was frayed at the seams, heavy with the textbooks he refused to leave behind, symbolizing a determination to learn despite a world that offered him no lessons but survival. He was bone-tired, his muscles aching from standing over steaming sinks, his skin chapped and raw. With a trembling hand, Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out his dinner. It was a stark visual opposite to the seafood towers and filet mignons being served across the street. It was a cracked plastic container holding a sandwich made at dawn, 2 slices of bread that had gone stale, and a single curling piece of cheese. It was meager, unappetizing, and cold. Yet Marcus looked at it with a profound, quiet gratitude. His stomach gave a hollow, painful growl, the sound of a growing boy who was perpetually underfed. He unwrapped the sandwich slowly, treating it like a feast. As he prepared to take his first bite, his eyes drifted across the street. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Oakhaven, he could see the silhouette of Sterling berating a maid for a minor infraction. He saw the golden light spilling out onto the pavement, a line of warmth that stopped just inches from his feet, as if even the light refused to touch someone so poor. Marcus didn't look with envy or bitterness. He pulled a battered sketchbook from his pocket, opened it to a page filled with complex architectural drawings, and began to sketch the hotel's intricate archway. He saw beauty in the structure, even if the people inside failed to see the humanity in him. He was a starving artist, sketching a feast, unaware that the invisible wall between his bench and that golden lobby was about to be shattered. The revolving doors of the Grand Oakhaven spun slowly, admitting a gust of freezing wind that made the nearest diners shiver in their silk evening gowns. But it wasn't the cold that froze the room. It was the figure that stumbled into the lobby. Arthur looked less like a human being and more like a pile of discarded rags that had miraculously learned to walk. His coat was a heavy, shapeless wool trench, stained with dark patches of mud and oil. His gray hair was matted, sticking up in tufts, and his face was smeared with grime. He moved with a shuffling, trembling gait, his eyes darting around the gilded room with a look of profound confusion, as if he had just woken up on a different planet. He took 3 steps onto the pristine, cream-colored Persian rug. With every step, his muddy boots left a thick, black smear, desecrating the perfection of the floor. The lobby fell silent. The piano player stopped mid-chord. I, Arthur croaked, his voice dry and cracking. He reached out a shaking hand to steady himself against a marble pedestal, but his grip was weak. His fingers slipped. Crash! The sound was explosive. A porcelain vase, delicate and painted with ancient blue dragons, toppled from the pedestal and shattered into 1,000 jagged shards across the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the murmurs began. "Oh my God," a woman in pearls gasped, clutching her napkin to her nose. "Can someone get him out of here? The smell!" "Where is security?" a man in a tuxedo hissed, looking at Arthur as if he were a diseased rat. "He's going to infect us all." From the far end of the lobby, Sterling appeared. He didn't walk, he stormed. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He marched across the room, his polished shoes crunching over the shards of the broken vase, and stopped inches from Arthur's face. "You!" Sterling barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "What do you think you are doing?" Arthur flinched, shrinking away from the younger man's aggression. I'm sorry," he stammered, his hands trembling violently. I need a place to sit. Just for a moment, please." "Sit?" Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh that sounded like a bark. He gestured grandly to the destruction on the floor. "You think you can just waltz in here, destroy property worth more than your entire worthless life, and then ask for a seat?" Sterling leaned in closer, his nose wrinkling in exaggerated disgust. "Look at you. You are disgusting. You are contaminating my hotel. You are a stain, do you hear me? A walking, breathing stain." "I can pay," Arthur whispered, reaching a shaking hand into his deep coat pocket. "Pay?" Sterling sneered. He slapped Arthur's hand away. "We don't take begging money here. We don't take coins you scrounged from the gutter. This is the Grand Oakhaven, not a shelter for failed human beings." Arthur swayed, looking like he might collapse. "I'm dizzy." "I don't care if you're dying," Sterling spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You are not dying in my lobby." He snapped his fingers. 2 burly security guards in dark suits materialized from the shadows. They didn't approach Arthur with caution, they approached him with menace. "Get this filth out of here," Sterling commanded, pointing to the door. "Drag him out, and throw him on the curb where he belongs. If he tries to come back in, call the police and tell them we have a vagrant destroying private property." One of the guards grabbed Arthur by the collar of his coat, while the other seized his arm. They were rough, treating the fragile old man like a sack of garbage. Arthur let out a small cry of pain as they yanked him backward. "Please!" Arthur gasped, his feet dragging on the floor, leaving one last streak of mud. "My chest! It hurts!" "Save the drama for the sidewalk," Sterling shouted after him. He turned to the guests, smoothing his suit jacket, his face instantly composing itself into a fake, apologetic smile. "My deepest apologies, ladies and gentlemen. The city's pest problem is getting out of hand. Housekeeping will have this cleaned up immediately." As the guards hauled Arthur toward the revolving doors, Sterling didn't see a human being in distress. He saw a problem solved. He saw a nuisance removed. But outside, through the glass, a pair of young, tired eyes watched the entire brutal scene unfold. Marcus had stopped drawing. His sandwich lay forgotten on his lap. He saw the way the guards shoved the old man. He saw the cruelty in Sterling's face. And unlike the wealthy patrons inside who went back to their champagne, Marcus felt a fire ignite in his chest, a fire born of the injustice that he knew all too well. The revolving doors shoved Arthur out with a final, dismissive force. He didn't just stumble, he collapsed. His knees hit the freezing concrete with a sickening thud, and his hands scraped against the rough pavement as he tried to break his fall. He lay there, a heap of discarded humanity, gasping for air in the biting wind. The security guards loomed over him for a second like bouncers at a club, ensuring the trash stayed out before turning their backs to retreat into the warmth. Across the street, the pencil dropped from Marcus's hand. He didn't check for traffic. He didn't zip up his bag. He didn't think about the fact that Sterling was watching through the glass, a man who could easily call the cops on him, too. Marcus just moved. He sprinted across the asphalt, his taped-up sneakers slapping against the road, closing the gap between indifference and compassion in seconds. "Sir!" Marcus skidded to a halt beside the fallen man. He didn't recoil at the smell or the mud. He dropped to his knees on the hard, cold ground, ruining his only pair of work pants without a second thought. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear me?" Marcus's voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the barking orders of the manager. Arthur looked up, his eyes wide and watery, filled with the humiliation of a man who had just been stripped of his dignity. I just needed to sit," he wheezed, his body shaking violently from the cold and shock. "It's okay. I got you. I got you." Marcus reached out. Time seemed to slow down. Marcus's hand, calloused from hours of scrubbing dishes, chapped from the cold, young and strong, wrapped around Arthur's hand, wrinkled, spotted with age, and trembling with weakness. It wasn't just a physical grip, it was an anchor. Marcus gently pulled, supporting Arthur's weight, helping him sit up against the cold stone planter. Arthur coughed, his face pale, his eyes fluttering. "I'm so hungry," he whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Marcus froze. A sharp, twisting cramp of hunger seized his own stomach. He hadn't eaten since breakfast. That sandwich in his hand was supposed to fuel him for the long walk home and the hours of study waiting for him. It was his fuel. It was his survival. Marcus looked at the sandwich, stale bread and curling cheese. Then he looked at Arthur's trembling lips. There was no hesitation, no calculation of loss. Marcus unwrapped the plastic with careful, reverent fingers. "Here," he said softly, pressing the sandwich into Arthur's hands. "It's not much, just cheese and bread, but it's clean. Please, eat." Arthur looked at the boy, stunned. He looked at the food like it was a diamond. "But, young man, this is yours." "You need it more," Marcus smiled, a genuine warm smile that defied the freezing night. "Go on, take it." High above them, standing on the top step of the hotel entrance like a gargoyle, Sterling watched. He crossed his arms, shielding himself from the wind, a smirk twisting his face. He watched the poor black boy feed the dirty old man and shook his head with disdain. "Look at that," Sterling chuckled to the doorman, his voice dripping with elitist venom. "Trash feeding trash. Birds of a feather flock together. They truly belong in the gutter." He turned on his heel and walked back inside, leaving the two failures alone in the cold. He didn't see the heroism, he only saw the poverty. But down on the sidewalk, amidst the exhaust fumes and the ice, the warmth of that single sandwich was starting to thaw a heart that had been frozen for a very long time. The wind had died down slightly, leaving a crisp, silent cold that hung over the city streets. On the wooden bench across from the grand oak haven, Marcus and Arthur sat shoulder to shoulder. The vast distance between their social statuses had been bridged by a shared space on a park bench and half a stale sandwich. Arthur ate with a slowness that was painful to watch. He savored every bite of the dry bread as if it were a delicacy prepared by a Michelin star chef. Color was slowly returning to his pale cheeks, and the violent trembling in his hands had subsided into a rhythmic shiver. "I haven't tasted anything this good in years," Arthur murmured, wiping a crumb from his chin with a dignity that seemed out of place for a man in his condition. He looked at Marcus, his blue eyes piercing through the grime on his face. "You gave me your dinner, son. What about you? You're a growing boy. You must be starving." Marcus shrugged, pulling his thin hoodie tighter around himself. He kicked at a patch of ice with his taped-up sneaker. "I'm used to it," he said, his voice devoid of self-pity. "I've gone longer without food. Besides, my mom always says, if you have enough to break bread, you have enough to share it." Arthur studied the boy's profile. "Your mother raised a good man. What's your name?" "Marcus." "I'm Arthur. Just Arthur." The old man paused, leaning back against the hard wood. "So, Marcus, you're washing dishes down the street, but you spend your break sitting in the freezing cold staring at that hotel. Why? Wishing you were inside?" Marcus chuckled, a dry sound. "Nah, I mean, it's warm in there, sure, but I'm not looking at the people. I'm looking at the building." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the battered sketchbook he had been holding earlier. The cover was torn, held together by the same duct tape that was on his shoes. He hesitated for a second, a flicker of insecurity crossing his face, before handing it to Arthur. "I study it," Marcus said quietly. "The Grand Oakhaven. It's a Beaux-Arts masterpiece, built in 1925. The structural load is distributed through those external columns, but if you look closely at the third floor—" He pointed a gloved finger toward the massive stone facade across the street. "The architrave is actually a modern reinforcement. They did a retrofit in the 90s. Arthur stopped chewing. The fog of the confused, helpless old man seemed to evaporate instantly. He took the sketchbook with hands that were suddenly steady. He opened it. The pages weren't filled with idle doodles or graffiti. They were filled with precise, scaled architectural drawings. There were cross-sections of foundations, calculations for load-bearing walls, and detailed sketches of intricate crown moldings. It was the work of a draftsman, not a dishwasher. Arthur flipped the page. He saw a drawing of the very lobby he had just been thrown out of. But Marcus had changed it. In the margins there were notes in neat, cramped handwriting. "Improve ADA accessibility here without compromising aesthetics. Lower the reception desk for inclusivity. Add radiant heating to the floor to reduce HVAC costs." "You did these?" Arthur asked, his voice low and sharp. "These calculations. Where did you learn this? This is structural engineering." "Books," Marcus replied, his eyes lighting up with the fire of a hidden passion. "The library lets me stay late. I read everything I can find on civil engineering and classical architecture. I figure, if I can learn how they built the world, maybe one day I can build a piece of it myself." Marcus looked down at his hands, the excitement fading back into reality. "But, college is expensive, and dishwashers don't get scholarships for drawing in the park." Arthur didn't respond immediately. He turned another page. He saw a design for a low-income housing complex, beautiful, dignified, and sustainable. It was titled, "The Shelter, a Place That Never Closes." The old man looked from the book to the hotel, then back to the boy. He saw the genius trapped in poverty, the brilliance that society had decided to ignore because of the clothes he wore. Arthur wasn't just looking at a kind boy anymore. He was looking at a prodigy. "You have a good eye, Marcus," Arthur said softly, closing the book but keeping his hand on the cover. "You see things other people miss. You see the bones of the building, not just the paint." "I guess," Marcus sighed, unaware that he was being interviewed by one of the greatest real estate minds of the century. "I just think buildings should be like people, Arthur. Strong on the inside. Supportive, That hotel." He nodded at the Grand Oakhaven. "It's beautiful, but it's cold. It pushes people out. I want to build things that pull people in." Arthur smiled. It was a small, secret smile. "Is that so?" "Yeah," Marcus said, rubbing his hands together to generate heat. "Someday." "Someday might be closer than you think," Arthur whispered. But before Marcus could ask what he meant, the heavy wooden doors of the hotel swung open again. The peace of their conversation was shattered by the clicking of polished shoes on the pavement. Sterling was back, and he wasn't alone. The storm was returning. The serene moment between the young dreamer and the old stranger was shattered like glass. The revolving doors of the Grand Oakhaven didn't just spin, they were shoved open with violent authority. Sterling marched out, flanked not by his usual hotel security, but by two uniformed police officers he had flagged down from the corner beat. Sterling's face was a mask of cold fury. To him, the sight of Marcus and Arthur sitting on the bench directly opposite his hotel entrance, eating a sandwich and sharing a notebook, was an act of war. It was a blemish on his pristine view, a reminder of the poverty he worked so hard to filter out. "There they are, officers!" Sterling shouted, pointing an accusing finger that trembled with indignation. "Loitering! Harassing my clientele! I told that vagrant to leave, and now he's dragged this street rat into his mess. They're plotting something. I want them gone!" Marcus scrambled to his feet, instinctively stepping in front of Arthur to shield him. "We're just sitting here!" Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking with fear but standing his ground. "This is a public park. We aren't bothering anyone." "You're bothering me," Sterling snarled, stepping off the curb and into their space. He towered over the sitting Arthur. "Look at this. Disgusting. Eating scraps like animals right in front of a five-star establishment." He noticed a plastic water bottle sitting on the bench next to Arthur. Cheap, half-empty water Marcus had bought with his last dollar. With a swift, cruel kick, Sterling sent the bottle flying. It skidded across the pavement, water splashing onto Marcus's taped-up shoes. "Pick it up and get out," Sterling hissed, leaning in close to Marcus's face. "Or I press charges for public disturbance and trespassing. Do you want a criminal record, boy? Do you want to explain to your mother why you're in a cell tonight?" The police officers looked uncomfortable but moved forward. "All right, kid," the older officer said, his hand resting near his belt. "Move along. The manager wants you gone. Don't make this hard." "But he can't walk," Marcus argued, desperation rising in his chest. "He's weak. He just needs a minute." "He can crawl for all I care," Sterling spat. "There is no place here for failures, no place for filth. You are a stain on this city, both of you. Now go, before I make sure you never work in this zip code again." The injustice burned in Marcus's throat like bile. He clenched his fists, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. He had done everything right. He worked hard, he studied, he helped people. And yet, men like Sterling held all the cards, able to crush him with a single phone call. One of the officers reached out and grabbed Marcus's arm. "That's enough backtalk, let's go." Arthur, who had been sitting quietly through the barrage, suddenly tried to stand. "Don't touch him," the old man said, his voice surprisingly firm. "The boy has done nothing." "Shut up, Grandpa," Sterling sneered. "Officer, cuff the kid if he resists. I want an example made." The click of handcuffs being unholstered echoed in the cold air. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing his future crumble. Arrest record would ruin his chances for scholarships. It was over. And then, the street vibration changed. It wasn't the wind. It was the deep, purring hum of high-performance engines. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. The officers turned their heads. Rounding the corner was not a taxi, not a delivery truck, but a convoy. 3 sleek, jet-black limousines, polished to a mirror shine, glided down the street like sharks in dark water. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that demanded attention. The lead car bore flags on the hood, the corporate flags of the Oakhaven Group. The convoy didn't pull up to the hotel entrance. They pulled up directly to the park bench. Sterling froze, his mouth hanging open. "What is—" The doors of the lead limousine flew open before it even came to a complete stop. 4 men in immaculate suits jumped out. They weren't bellboys. They were executives. Men with silver hair and serious faces, the kind of men Sterling only saw in company newsletters. "Mr. Chairman!" one of the executives shouted, panic in his voice. He ignored Sterling. He ignored the police. He ran straight toward the bench. Sterling looked around, confused. "Chairman? Who is he talking to?" The executive didn't stop at Marcus. He dropped to one knee right in front of the dirty, mud-stained old man Sterling had just kicked. "Mr. Arthur!" the executive gasped, looking terrified. "We've been tracking your phone. We lost your signal. Are you all right, sir? Did you fall?" The silence that descended on the street was heavier than the limousine. The police officer slowly took his hand off Marcus's arm. Sterling's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. Arthur stood up. He brushed the crumbs of Marcus's sandwich from his lap. He didn't look frail anymore. He straightened his back, and suddenly, the vagrant was gone. In his place stood a titan. Arthur looked at the executive, then slowly turned his gaze to Sterling. "I didn't fall, David," Arthur said, his voice cold and clear as ice. "I was thrown out." The scene on the sidewalk transformed instantly from a police intervention into a royal court session. The four men who had burst from the limousines weren't just employees, they were the titans of the hospitality industry. The chief financial officer, the vice president of operations, and the head of global security. Men Sterling had only ever seen in framed portraits in the corporate office, were now hovering around the dirty old man, their faces pale with anxiety. "Sir, please, here is a handkerchief," the CFO stammered, offering a silk square to wipe the mud from Arthur's cheek. "We lost your GPS signal when you entered the park. We feared the worst." "I'm fine, David," Arthur said, pushing the handkerchief away. He slowly unbuttoned his filthy, oversized trench coat. Underneath, hidden by the layers of grime, was the collar of a shirt that, while dirty now, was clearly bespoke. He straightened his spine, and the transformation was physical. The stoop of age and weakness vanished. The trembling ceased. The foggy look in his eyes sharpened into the steel gaze of a man who had built an empire from scratch. Arthur Oakhaven, the founder and majority shareholder of the Oakhaven Group, stood tall. He didn't look like a vagrant anymore. He looked like a king in disguise. Sterling, standing frozen on the curb, felt the blood drain from his face so fast it made him dizzy. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The name Arthur finally clicked. The rumors of the reclusive owner who liked to test his properties personally, it wasn't a myth. It was a nightmare, and Sterling was living in the center of it. Mr. Oakhaven?" Sterling whispered, the name choking him. Arthur turned slowly to face him. The silence of the street was absolute. Even the traffic seemed to hold its breath. "You called me a stain," Arthur said. His voice was no longer the rasp of a dying man. It was a deep, resonant baritone that carried the weight of billions. "You called me filth. You said I was contaminating your hotel." "Sir, I didn't know," Sterling gasped, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing cold. "I was just following protocol, maintaining standards. You looked—" "I looked like a human being in need," Arthur cut him off, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "And that was the test, Sterling. It's easy to serve a man in a tuxedo who tips you $100. Anyone can do that. But the true measure of service, the true measure of my company, is how you treat the man who has nothing to give you but his gratitude." Arthur gestured to the grand facade of the hotel behind them. "I built this place to be a sanctuary, but you have turned it into a fortress of arrogance." The crowd of wealthy patrons who had gathered at the windows and near the door watched in stunned silence. The pest they had wrinkled their noses at was the man who signed their membership cards. The security guards who had manhandled him were now staring at their shoes, praying to become invisible. But the most shocked person of all was Marcus. The teenager stood just a few feet away, clutching his empty lunch container. He looked from the billionaire to the police officers, who had hastily holstered their handcuffs and stepped back, and then down at his own duct-taped shoes. He had just shared a stale sandwich with one of the richest men in America. He had lectured the owner of the Grand Oakhaven about the structural integrity of his own building. "You," Marcus stammered, his voice small, "you own the building?" Arthur turned to Marcus. The cold fury left his face, replaced instantly by a warmth that confused the executives. To them, Arthur was a terrifying boss. To Marcus, he was just the friend from the bench. "I do, son," Arthur smiled gently. "And you were right about the architrave on the third floor. It was a retrofit. Cost me $3 million in 1995. Arthur stepped away from the executives and walked back to Marcus. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, the same shoulder the police officer had just grabbed. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced, addressing his board of directors while pointing at Marcus. "This young man is the only person in this entire city who treated me with dignity today. While my manager kicked me and my security dragged me, this boy gave me his dinner. He ruined his clothes to help me up. He risked his freedom to defend me." Arthur looked back at Sterling, his eyes narrowing. "Dramatic irony, isn't it, Sterling? You tried to arrest the only person here who actually embodies the values of the Grand Oakhaven." Sterling tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his own execution. "David!" Arthur snapped his fingers at the CFO without looking away from Sterling. "Get my car ready, we're going inside. It seems I have some immediate personnel changes to make." "Yes, sir," the CFO nodded vigorously. Arthur turned back to Marcus. "Grab your bag, Marcus. You're not walking home in the cold tonight." "Me?" Marcus blinked, still processing the shift in reality. "But I have to work tomorrow. The diner—" "You're done washing dishes, Marcus," Arthur said, and for the first time a hint of the powerful tycoon leaked into his tone. "Bring your notebook. We have a lot to discuss, and I believe I still owe you a meal." As Arthur guided the stunned teenager toward the open door of the lead limousine, the hierarchy of the street flipped completely. The boy with the taped shoes was entering the chariot of kings, while the man in the bespoke suit stood shivering on the sidewalk, realizing he had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. Arthur paused with his hand on the open door of the limousine. The cold wind whipped around them, but the silence in the group was absolute. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Sterling, who was trembling not from the temperature, but from the terrifying certainty of his impending doom. "Wait," Arthur commanded. His voice was quiet, but it stopped everyone in their tracks. The executives froze. The police officers stood at attention. Arthur pointed a finger at the pavement. There, resting in the gutter where it had skidded, lay the cheap plastic water bottle Sterling had kicked moments ago. It was dented, dirty, and insignificant. "There is one piece of trash left on this street that needs to be dealt with," Arthur said. Sterling blinked, hope flickering in his eyes. He thought Arthur was referring to the bottle. He straightened up, eager to please. "Yes, sir, I'll have the janitor—" "You," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "Pick it up." Sterling froze. The color drained from his face. "Sir?" "You kicked it," Arthur said, his gaze unyielding. "You pick it up." The humiliation was palpable. Sterling, the man who wouldn't touch a door handle without a sanitizer wipe, the man who treated his staff like serfs, looked around at the crowd. The wealthy guests in the window were watching. The police were watching. His own bosses were watching. Slowly, painfully, Sterling bent his knees. His expensive suit fabric strained. He reached down into the slush and mud of the gutter. His manicured fingers grasped the dirty plastic bottle. As he stood up, clutching the garbage, he looked small. "Now," Arthur continued, gesturing to Marcus, "give it to him, and apologize." Sterling's jaw tightened. This was worse than being fired. This was the dismantling of his ego. He turned to the 17-year-old boy in the taped-up shoes. Marcus stood tall, not with arrogance, but with a quiet dignity that Sterling had never possessed. Sterling choked on the words. "I'm sorry." He held out the bottle. Marcus took it. "Apologize for the insult," Arthur corrected sharply. "Apologize for assuming that a man's worth is determined by his wallet." "I apologize," Sterling whispered, staring at his shoes. "I was wrong." "Yes," Arthur said, buttoning his coat. "You were, and you will have plenty of time to reflect on that error." Arthur turned to the head of Human Resources, who was standing by the car. "Effective immediately, Mr. Sterling is relieved of his duties. And David?" "Yes, sir," the CFO answered. "Ensure that his termination is noted as gross misconduct, and send a memo to the Hotel Association. If he wants to work in this industry again, he can start by washing dishes. I want him blacklisted from every management position in the city." Sterling collapsed onto the curb, the same curb he had thrown Arthur onto. He was finished. Arthur turned his back on the broken man and focused entirely on Marcus. The tension in his shoulders evaporated, replaced by a businesslike intensity. He reached out and gently took the battered sketchbook from Marcus's hand. He held it up, Not like a piece of charity, but like a valuable asset. Marcus, Arthur said, tapping the cover. I don't give handouts. I don't believe in them. I believe in investments. Marcus looked at the book, then at the billionaire. Sir? You gave me your lunch because you have a good heart, Arthur said. But that's not why I'm talking to you now. Kindness makes you a good man, but this... He opened the book to the page with the structural calculations. This makes you a valuable one. Arthur looked Marcus in the eye. My company spends millions a year on architects who design pretty boxes that have no soul. They build monuments to their own egos. You see buildings as shelters. You see them as service. I like to draw, Marcus stammered. No, Arthur shook his head. You don't just draw, you solve problems, and I have a lot of problems that need solving. Arthur turned to the CFO. David, call the dean of the School of Architecture at MIT. Tell him I'm calling in that favor. He looked back at Marcus. You're done washing dishes, son. The Oakhaven Group is offering you a full scholarship. Tuition, room, board, and a stipend. But there's a catch. Marcus stopped breathing. A catch? You have to work for me, Arthur smiled, a genuine shark-like grin of a businessman who just made the deal of a lifetime. Summer internships, every year. You're going to shadow my lead engineers. You're going to learn how to turn these sketches into steel and glass, because I'm not going to let a mind like yours waste away scrubbing plates. Arthur extended his hand. Do we have a deal, Marcus? Marcus looked at the hand. It was the same hand he had pulled up from the sidewalk. He looked at Sterling, weeping on the curb. He looked at the sketchbook that held his dreams. For the first time in his life, the door wasn't slamming in his face. It was holding wide open. Marcus wiped his palm on his hoodie and shook Arthur's hand. We have a deal, sir. Good, Arthur nodded, opening the car door. Now get in. We have a lot of work to do. And I believe I promised you dinner. I hope you like steak because I'm starving. The limousine did not drive Marcus home immediately. Instead, it circled the block and pulled right back up to the main entrance of the Grand Oakhaven. But this time, the world looked different. The same doorman who had sneered at Marcus an hour ago rushed forward to open the car door, bowing so low his nose nearly touched his knees. He didn't look at Marcus's duct-taped sneakers or his stained hoodie. He looked only at the man standing beside him. Arthur stepped out, and the air around him seemed to crackle with authority. He placed a hand on Marcus's back. Walk with me, son. Head up. Marcus took a deep breath. He stepped onto the red carpet that led into the lobby. An hour ago, he was a stain on the sidewalk. Now he was crossing the threshold as the guest of honor. They walked through the revolving doors, the same doors that had shoved Arthur out into the cold. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The beautiful people, in their evening gowns and tuxedos, fell silent as the pair walked by. They stared. They whispered. But this time there was no disgust in their eyes. There was only fear and curiosity. They saw the mud on Arthur's coat, but they also saw the power in his stride. They saw the poverty in Marcus's clothes, but they saw the favor of the king resting upon him. Arthur led Marcus past the concierge desk, past the spot where the vase had shattered, and straight into the main dining room, the Gold Room, where reservations were booked 6 months in advance. The maitre d', a man who usually stopped people like Marcus from even looking through the window, was shaking. Mr. Oakhaven, we didn't expect... Your usual table is ready, right this way. They were seated at the best table in the house, by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the park. From here, Marcus could see the cold, empty bench where they had shared the sandwich. It looked so small from this height, so far away. You see that view? Arthur asked, unfolding a crisp linen napkin that was whiter than anything Marcus owned. Marcus looked out at the city lights. It's beautiful. It's perspective, Arthur corrected. Most people sit in these chairs and look down on the world. They think that because they are high up, they are better than the people down there. They mistake altitude for attitude. A waiter arrived, terrified, pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses. Arthur waited for him to leave before leaning in. Marcus, look around this room. What do you see? Marcus looked. He saw men in $5,000 Italian suits. He saw women wearing diamonds the size of grapes. He saw laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. "I see rich people," Marcus said. "I see costumes," Arthur replied softly. "That manager Sterling? He wore a suit that cost more than your mother makes in a month. He spoke with perfect grammar. He knew which fork to use for the salad. But inside? Inside, he was bankrupt. He was morally poor." Arthur took a sip of water, his eyes locking onto Marcus with an intensity that burned. "You, on the other hand, you're wearing shoes held together by tape. You have $5 to your name. But when I fell, you were the only one rich enough to help me. You possess the only currency that actually matters in this life, Marcus. Character." Marcus looked down at his hands, the hands that had scrubbed dishes, the hands that had drawn skyscrapers, the hands that had lifted a billionaire from the gutter. He realized then that he didn't need to be ashamed of them anymore. "I'm going to teach you how to build, Marcus," Arthur continued. "I'm going to teach you engineering, physics, and design. But I can't teach you what you did today. That is the foundation that cannot be bought." The steak arrived, a massive, sizzling cut that smelled like heaven. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the food. He was thinking about the sketchbook in his bag. He looked at the hotel around him. He saw the marble columns, the gold leaf, the exclusivity. "Mr. Oakhaven?" Marcus asked quietly. "Call me Arthur." "Arthur, when I become an architect, I don't want to build places like this." Arthur stopped cutting his steak. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what do you want to build?" Marcus looked out the window again, at the dark corners of the park where the homeless slept, where he had almost slept many nights. "I want to build places that have doors like this." Marcus gestured to the grand entrance. "But that are open to everyone. I want to build beauty that doesn't require a ticket. I want to prove that you can make something magnificent without locking people out." A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. It was the smile of a man who knows his legacy is safe. "Then that is exactly what we will do," Arthur said. "The Oakhaven Group has been looking for a new direction. Perhaps it's time we stopped building fortresses and started building bridges." He raised his glass. "To the future, Marcus, and to the architect who will redesign it." Marcus clinked his glass against the billionaire's. The sound rang out clear and pure, a bell tolling the end of his old life and the beginning of a new one. As they ate, the camera pulls back, through the window, out into the cold night air. We see the contrast one last time, the warmth of the restaurant and the cold of the street. But the barrier has been broken. The boy from the bench is now inside, not because he changed his clothes, but because he didn't change his heart. The screen fades to black as Arthur's voiceover delivers the final lesson, a line that would be shared millions of times across the world. "You can wear the most expensive suit in the world, but it will never cover a cheap soul. The true value of a man isn't in what he has in his pocket, but in what he is willing to give when his pockets are empty."